From an article in the Daily Mail, this man was described as someone who Sir Andrew Strauss first noticed and promoted. Ed Smith fought the world, and now Rob Key swears by this man. So we're absolutely delighted to welcome the ECB's performance director, Mo Bobat, onto the 212 Men. Mo, welcome.
Yeah, welcome. Thanks for having me. You shouldn't believe everything you read in the Mail. That's the first.
Well, Mo, I first came across your work. I think it was the Oval Test last year in one of the intervals where you came on, I think, at lunch break, and you sort of displayed these figureheads of every England player across the position. And I found the analysis so interesting. I remember talking to you, Bot, about it and how it made me realise that there was method in the system, and the results we're seeing, and I guess the vast improvement under Rob Key's leadership and Ben Stokes and Brendan McCullum. It was really good to sort of get that core detail. But for listeners that might not be aware of your role, could you give us a bit of an overview of your responsibilities at the ECB?
Yeah, of course. Well, look, my official job title is Performance Director of the England men's teams, but also, and more crucially, I guess, our pathway, which I'll go on to explain a little bit. In a nutshell, I work really closely with Rob Key in his role as managing director. I have some England-facing responsibilities, which includes things like supporting selection, particularly squad selection, because team selection is often just left down to coach and captain, but supporting squad selection, much of which you would have heard about in that Oval Test. I work really closely with the head coaches, so both Brendan and Matthew, around long-term planning, their staffing structure, and a lot of my staff who get deployed into their environments, but also things like player preparation and things like that. I work closely with Rob Key on contracting, central contracts. And then, look, my own leadership profile, the stuff that I'm specifically in charge of overseeing, I oversee our pathway, which is our Lions level and our under-19s. I oversee player identification, which is led more specifically by David Court, who was on that oval session, because the two of us kind of tag teamed that with others. Oversee performance analysis and all of the science and medicine disciplines. So that's strength and conditioning, physiotherapy, nutrition, psychology. And then our performance centre, which is our sort of performance home based in Loughborough. So it's quite a broad area, that leadership responsibility, as I'm sure you get a feel for. So it's just worth saying that I've got a great team of people that report into me and who head up each of those areas, some of which I've mentioned, and there's probably too many to mention, but I've got a great team of people that oversee those areas. But that's kind of the breadth of my leadership profile.
Yeah, I guess your sort of pathway to the current role is an interesting one, and very much inspiring. How exactly did you go from teaching into the role that you are now, and the progressional route from that?
Well, yeah. Look, first thing to say, I'm probably best described as a failed sportsman, probably like most of us. Failed cricketer. I went to university and studied sports science and management. Didn't really know what I wanted to do then. And actually started coaching at university. I'm quite fortunate that I kind of did my level 1 and level 2 whilst at uni, and started doing a bit of coaching at Notts. And then came out of university and fell into teaching, which I never thought I would do, but really enjoyed it actually. And teaching was quite a good fit alongside coaching, because you have decent time in your evenings for stuff. You've got your summer holidays and weekends. So I pretty much had a career for 7 years of teaching and coaching sort of concurrently. And then in 2011, I applied for a job with the ECB, which was at that stage working like predominantly on our development program, our under 17s and under 19s. And I was managing our under 17s as my main kind of first role. And then within a year or two was managing the under 19s, which was a role I did for a few years. And I really, really enjoyed, like a hugely rewarding role. And many of the lads in the England environment now are lads that I probably first spent touring time with. So it's been quite nice to see their progression. But I suppose a critical point to make, that alongside that, we were running a talent PhD back then, and a guy called Ed Barney, who's now performance director at GB Hockey. He was the PhD student, and he's not got a cricket background. So I guess he and I worked quite closely together on him doing a lot of the smart stuff kind of from an academic perspective, and me and a few other people trying to help him embed his findings. And many of those were around things like scouting, performance analysis, and statistics, and talent testing, essentially. And we started embedding a lot of that stuff at under 19 level, which is quite a safe place to be creative. And then in 2016, when Andrew Strauss came in as managing director, naturally did a bit of a review of the whole pathway, and he really liked the work we were doing at that level and asked me to extend it up the pathway. And he kind of made me officially in charge of player ID for half of my role. And then he set me a challenge of proving concept. And a year later, true to his word, he made me full-time player ID lead. which is where I properly immersed myself in the sorts of things you heard on that Oval interview, where we really started to take, I believe, things like player identification and selection to another level. And then in 2018, Ed Smith joined us as selector, which was great for me because he and we shared a lot of common ground in terms of our views, and we worked really close together on England selection. And then 2019, the role of performance director became vacant because somebody moved on, and I went for it and I managed to get the role. Which allowed me to grow my leadership experience. And I've done that kind of 3 or 4 years now, but obviously a couple of those years have been COVID years, which has been quite interesting. But had a couple of normal years and a couple of COVID years as PD so far.
And in terms of kind of getting talent into the ECB, how valuable do you think it is to kind of get talent from outside of the system, and I suppose to take people from different backgrounds with different experience to think about things in a different way?
I think it's crucial. Obviously, I'm a beneficiary of that myself. I haven't played professional cricket or international cricket. And people often ask me that sort of question around my career profile being slightly different to anyone else because I haven't played or haven't had that journey. But I just think I'm surrounded by people that have played for England. Like, there's no shortage of England caps around me when I'm in a meeting. So we're not low on that. Yeah. So bringing in people from other environments that can bring a different perspective, I think, is really important. And there's a lot in the world at the minute around diversity and cognitive diversity and the importance of that, and I really advocate that. But I do think it's important that people bring a strength. They bring something. So whilst I might not know exactly what it feels like to go out and open the batting in Mumbai or at the Gabba, I do feel like I can bring other strengths that complement the strengths of those other people. And I think if you can assemble teams that have complementary strengths, I think you just make more progress, really. So I think it's really, really important.
In terms of kind of when you sit around the table and kind of there's this new approach that the test team is obviously taking, how much of that new approach is kind of a big bang, new management's in and we're going for this direction, or is part of kind of planning behind the scenes and maybe adapting it slightly?
Well, look, Bazball is probably what you're referring to, and it's a phrase.
Are you allowed to call it that, Mo?
Well, no, I don't think I am. But it's certainly a phrase, or it's a label that I know that both Brendan and Ben aren't that keen on. Mainly because it's a bit of an oversimplification. But if I try and explain what it means, like as you've observed from the playing style, in terms of the way we play our cricket, when we talk about batting, it's Brendan wants players that are smart enough and skillful enough to know when they need to absorb pressure, but as quickly as possible being able to transfer that into applying pressure and putting the opposition under pressure. So that gets lost a little bit when people just think about run rates and scoring rates. But he talks there about that subtlety of absorbing and applying pressure. Both him and Ben talk quite a lot and clearly focus a lot on taking wickets without worrying too much around run rates, and actually understanding that if you're a wicket-taking threat, you'll probably dry up the scoreboard anyway. You don't have to have the intent to dry up the scoreboard. You can attack and take wickets. And then from a fielding perspective, essentially just being really selfless and throwing yourself around for the team and chase everything down to the boundary and really committing to your teammates. So the game plan is as simple as that. But when the essence of your question is an important one, because behind the scenes, there's so much more to it, because it's important to consider how you unlock that in players. How do you develop players that are capable of doing those things? So from a pathway perspective, this winter, we've spent a lot of time, and the focus I've had at Lions level, and that we've tried to have at under-19 level with Mike Yardy, who's our head coach there, we've tried to really help players to understand and recognise situations and moments. That's almost like the first step, because too many players, and if you guys have played, you all kind of experience your own version of it. Cricket's the sort of game where you can become so insular. You can think so much about your own game, your own form, how many runs you got last week, all that sort of stuff. And you just want players to be able to lift their head up, have that presence of mind to go, what's actually happening in this situation and moment. And then the second thing that we talk quite a lot around is like really understanding your strengths. Like, if you're better than everyone else at something, well, spend a lot of time doing that, like back your strengths. And the third bit is like, when you choose a course of action, whether it is to apply pressure, just commit wholeheartedly, because we would, if we replay what this looks like, if somebody's made a good assessment of the situation, if they understand their strengths and they've practiced their strengths well, and if they have a go at committing to those strengths, there's no consequences for failure. Like, that's exactly what we want them to do. But if someone's a bit tentative because they don't commit, or if they actually do something that isn't a strength of theirs and they're trying to copy someone else, or if they misread the situation and not that smart in their assessment, that's when you can help them review that and get better. But if they do all of those things, then it's fine. And I guess the last bit worth saying is to then create that environment behind the scenes. And this is where Brendan's been outstanding, is like, how do you want your coaches and players to interact off the field so that that becomes their natural way of doing things? And, you know, you've got to be quite precise and deliberate with how you train and really focus on what players need, not just what they think they want. And part of that is an education, but also some of that is about how you design practice. It's important to be really positive, and Brendan is like, you know, Brendan and Ben are so uber positive. Like, Ben's off the charts, to be honest with you. But really focusing on a strengths-based approach, which is quite refreshing and at times quite anti-English, actually, because we typically focus on weakness and what we can't do. And we're trying to recognize positive intent. We're trying to recognize what players can do, even when we're in selection. Not worrying too much about what players can't do, but thinking about what they will bring. The other important bits are how coaches react to failure. Like, when someone doesn't do well, how do you react? What's your body language like? And ultimately, the thing that Brendan's brought in, which has been like really refreshing for everyone, is just getting players to appreciate that this is a time of your life. Like, for England, like, love it, love every bit of it. He sort of acknowledges that he got to the end of his career and looked back on it and thought that was fun. He wants people to look on it whilst they're doing it as fun. So we're trying to really make that come across, and we think all of that will lend itself to being far more entertaining for the audience and for everybody who watches Test cricket.
It's so refreshing, isn't it? Because we saw the black cloud of COVID, you know, bring a lot of misery to players, you know, from a welfare point of view and from a morale point of view. But I think straight away we can, even from the first game, I think, you know, if I can think back to Lords, the Test match when Brendan's sort of tenure took place, you saw players like Jack Leach throwing himself on the floor, albeit, you know, the repercussions of an injury. But, you know, we saw positivity. We saw players that had been sort of criminally underperforming, so we know what their abilities are, to all of a sudden, you know, unleashing this inner talent that I think a lot of fans were frustrated for themselves, you know, and I think that was good to see from my end.
And on that, like, it's easy to forget and underestimate what the environment, and, you know, I can speak firsthand about this, what we went through in those COVID years. And I don't want this to sound all poor me, because ultimately we do jobs we love. But, you know, we had a couple of years where we knew we had to get cricket on, because the financial structure in our country is that 75% of all of the money in the game comes from the England men's team playing at home. That's a huge weight of responsibility. Like, in that first COVID summer, if we didn't play cricket at all that summer, the game lost £400 million. If we played all of our cricket behind closed doors, we still lost 100 million, but we actually secured 300 million pounds, pretty much. Like, so we knew the weight of our responsibility, and then you try and have that responsibility for the opposition when you tour, and you value their finances as well. But 2 years of that, with the performance pressure, locked in environments that are heavily constrained, not being able to move around very easily and freely. You know, I'll never forget the 2 weeks of quarantine in Australia, going into the Ashes. And then when you lose as well and it dials up, like, it's a pretty tough place. So certainly in Ben's case, you know, Ben's talked quite a lot about some of his own challenges with his own mental health, and he's been very brave in talking about that. But I think his reaction to the way we're approaching things is, some of it has come from what the whole team and environment experienced, and that, you know, the Ashes being the most brutal end of that, like, the environment was on its knees, is fair to say. And it's been quite refreshing to have someone like Brendan come in, and Ben's leadership, where we've been able to take that up a level. And the likes of Chris Silverwood and Joe Root had a real tough time with that. And, you know, that's a tough card they got played, really.
And in terms of, I suppose, scheduling post-COVID and maybe pre-COVID as well, the cricket schedule keeps on ratcheting up and ratcheting up. A good example is this winter, going from a test to an ODI within 24 hours on different sides of the world. How much of England's resilience to be able to put out a good test side and then go and compete in an ODI in Bangladesh is kind of running hot on a really talented generation versus kind of what we have to plan for as modern cricket, and that you will need two really competitive sides? Do you reckon it's COVID hangover, or is this something we should plan for?
Yeah, and it's a really good question, because, look, it's probably quite a complex answer. The first thing I'll say, I guess, is that developing depth, player depth, and across formats, it's been a deliberate tactic of ours for a while. And we've had some successes, we've had some challenges, but it's definitely something we've done on purpose. And I think we're seeing some of the benefit of that now. Like, we've been talking for quite some time, and it was something that certainly Ed and I used to talk about, is that we didn't feel like we just had to beat our opposition. We had to beat the schedule. And and we play more cricket than anyone, and often concurrently as well, as you've described. And as a result of COVID, that got pushed to an extreme because we had lots of catch-up cricket, and we had to make up series that got postponed. But also, and people forget this, that we couldn't move players very easily. Like, you couldn't just move a player from one series to another because they've got to do 2 weeks quarantine, or there weren't any flights, or whatever. So, like, if you think back to some of the criticism we got with our India selection away, this whole Western rotation that we got kind of a bit of stick for. We all feel at ease with that because we tried to do the best thing for English cricket. We tried to do the best thing for players and their mental health. People would say, why didn't he come back for this game? Why didn't he go for that game? Well, it's because there was no flights, because they had to do 2 weeks quarantine. Like, there's so many extra things that...
So complicated, yeah.
Yeah, it was, and it was so complicated. So we've been deliberately trying to do this for a while. But if I speak about the more positive element of that answer, so I guess straight after we won the 2019 World Cup, we did a bit of a review and a reset. And I started as performance director. Chris Silverwood started as head coach pretty much the same week. And we knew that we had to beat the schedule. So we thought that Test cricket would remain a priority for us. And in white ball cricket, we're probably always having to alternate between ODI and T20 cricket based on the next global event. So we won that ODI World Cup and immediately deprioritized. We didn't want to. You almost have to deprioritize your ODI team after you've just become world champions, and you prioritize T20 cricket because we knew we had 2 T20 World Cups coming up. You then, you hopefully do well and you're successful, like winning the last T20 World Cup, and immediately you then switch to prioritize your ODI cricket, and you deprioritize T20 cricket. And we don't want to have to do that, but it's the reality. But what it does afford you is, it means you can rest players. It means you can give people a chance to rehab, get into conditioning work, spend time at home with families, all the things they need to do. But equally, it means you can expose people to opportunities and you can develop depth. And I think we've been able to do that. So over the last 2 years, we exposed a lot of players to ODI cricket to test out what they might be able to do in T20 cricket. And we're doing vice versa now. And I think we're seeing the benefit of that. And look, the other bit of our depth development, if you talk about the generational players, I think it's worth also mentioning that our system, all of the counties and all of the players in county cricket, they've aligned behind a philosophy. And that philosophy and style of play was led by Straussy, Owen Morgan, Trevor Bayliss, Paul Farbrace. The way that they said about playing in 2015-16, it caught fire amongst the players.
Filtered down, yeah.
Yeah, massively. And so I think we're getting a combination of all of those things happening. And it's what we're hoping for in Test cricket. We're hoping that our style of play becomes infectious. And I think it will. We don't want to preach to people about how they play, but if I think players want to play a more exciting and engaging brand of cricket, they will. And it just means you develop that depth of talent, and then it's a case of putting the right opportunities in front of people.
Yeah. I've read a lot what Rob Keys had to say, and I think both you and Rob are quite honest people about the game and your thoughts on it. How valuable do you see franchise cricket in terms of giving players opportunities all year round to prove themselves at the highest level? Where does that sit with you?
Yeah, and I think you referenced Rob Key's approach, and I'm certainly sure that I'm pretty similar in that franchise cricket has become one of those divisive things where you've got those people that just love watching it and others that think it's bad and it's going to be the death of everything else. And I just think we need to move it away from this binary discussion where it's good or bad and just think a bit more deeply about it. Look, ultimately, like, time on task has gone up for our players. Like, if you're a white ball cricketer, you're just doing a lot more of it over the course of a year. So of course you're going to improve. It's like anything. If any of us do anything longer, you're going to get better at that. And I think that we benefited from that, particularly being a Northern Hemisphere team and our season and our winter aligning favourably for most franchise cricket. We've got lads playing cricket all summer and then having a whole winter of great, exciting, competitive white ball cricket. The other benefits we've had are things like exposure to conditions. Like, guys get used to playing in different parts of the world, and we've had some fantastic examples this winter. You look at David Malan's 100 recently in Bangladesh. Like, I think that was something like the 28th time he'd played a game in Dhaka. Like, that's incredible. Yeah. More than 50 games in Bangladesh. Like, some people don't have that level of experience in their home conditions, never mind overseas. You look at Alex Hales in the T20 World Cup. It's no surprise he was dominant out there when he dominated the Big Bash as many times as he had. Yeah. So I think at the minute, we've got to be honest, it gives us a competitive advantage. Yeah. And exposing players to pressurised cricket, expectations as an overseas player, knockout games as well. Like, our cricket, we don't have a lot of knockout cricket. So playing in these competitions where something's on the line is great prep for a World Cup. Yeah. As well as exposure to players and coaches, and all of that is great. So look, I see loads of upside. I think it's also important to factor in that players and coaches do need to think really carefully around the quality of the opportunities, because not every opportunity is the same.
Yeah.
And they need to just take that step back at times and think about their rounded program. What impact does it have on their red ball cricket, if any? When do they get their fitness and conditioning work in? When do they need to rest? When do they need some time at home? As long as they're thinking responsibly about all of that, myself and Rob are really sort of positive and proactive about encouraging people to go. Like, we don't see it as bad, and we don't think we should be holding people back. If anything, our players have benefited hugely from it.
You've just given obviously a great example there with the David Balan in Bangladesh and exposure there through white ball. We see this a lot in white ball, especially now with the emergence of the franchise leagues that we're seeing across the world. But this is less prevalent, I guess, in red ball. Do you think there'd be more value in that if different cricket boards got top players exposure in their red ball formats?
Yeah, look, obvious point. There's no red ball franchise cricket as such. So you're talking about first class cricket overseas, which isn't that straightforward. You go to Australia, there's only 6 states. Like, they've got a lot of good players themselves. Getting a state game isn't something that many players have done. Even in India, they don't have overseas players for first class cricket. So there are some obvious constraints that make it difficult. So we probably have more players traveling overseas than most other countries, but they end up going overseas to play in club cricket just beneath first class cricket, which is still good experience for them. And I think it's invaluable. And we've had a lot of players that have gone and done that again this winter. Now that COVID's not as much of an issue for us this winter, certainly a lot more players have gone overseas to play cricket again. In fact, quite a few went to places like Zimbabwe this year and places like that where they could get first class cricket overseas again, which I think is great. And I think that's great experience for them. But I guess, look, would it be better if we had more red ball exposure? Yes. But that is where our Lions and under-19 programs come in as well. Like, it's quite obvious that there's a gap between international cricket and domestic cricket, like there would be in any country. And part of our international pathway is to bridge the gap between domestic cricket and international cricket. And we try to do that through our international pathway. And particularly our focus centres on red ball, because a bit like you've described, a lot of the players are getting their white ball gap bridging from franchise cricket. So there's no point at Lions level, me playing loads of white ball games. We play a small number of ODIs to give them that ODI exposure, because there's a bit less of that. We don't do any Lions T20 cricket. There's not much point. But we do a lot of Lions red ball cricket, because that gap bridging needs to happen. And that's how we then transition players from domestic cricket into Brendan and Ben's team. So that's a real priority for us. And even if you look this winter, our Lions team played a couple of tests in Sri Lanka and did really well. Our under-19s drew a series out in Australia, 2 tests, and played really well. All of the teams played a similar style of cricket to the first team. So you can see that sort of pathway in terms of style of cricket, player ID, exposure to red ball conditions, subcontinent and southern hemisphere exposure. That's exactly what the pathway does. In the absence of those first class opportunities that you're kind of talking about, it's essential that our international pathway does that job.
And in terms of kind of, obviously throughout this conversation, we build a really good picture of the pathway that we give English players in terms of becoming high quality commodities on the world stage. How do we, as an English cricket stakeholders, de-risk that we develop players to a certain level and then they go off into the franchise cricket and we lose them? How do you kind of keep the talent? What do we need to do there?
Yeah, well, and look, these are some of the important questions that a lot of people are asking themselves at the minute. And it's fair to say there's quite a bit of concern around our game about where the game might be going, and a bit like I said earlier, the risk and threat of things like franchise cricket. But again, I have a preference for focusing on positives, and the positive is that there's probably been no better time to be a cricketer in professional cricket ever, in terms of what opportunity and finances. And if we look at what that means, it just means that we're probably going to have more young people attracted to being professional cricketers. Like, that's great. We should get excited by that. If we have more people choose cricket over competitor sports like football, rugby, whatever other sports they might want to play, because they see a more attractive career profile, we should be delighted with that, because it just means we're going to have a bigger and richer talent pool, and the game's going to thrive in this country. So in the first instance, I think there's no better time to play, and I think it's great that that's the case. I think the other thing that's really important for people to think about is that there are loads of uncertainties, and none of us really know what the future is going to look like. All I can say is it will look different, and we've got to get our heads around that. Like, why would it look the same in 5 years' time as it looks today, or the way it looked 20 years ago? Get your head around that it's going to change. We should all try and get it to adapt and change for the better, but many of these things are out of our hands. Like, the biggest driver is commercial value, and by commercial value, I typically mean broadcast value, because ultimately what the TV companies want to pay for, which is what your big market audiences want to watch, will drive the narrative. And we're talking largely at times about the Indian cricket population. Like, if the Indian cricket population wants to watch something, broadcasts are more likely to pay for it. And if they're going to pay for it, it means you're going to prioritize it. So whether us three love Test cricket more than we love T20 cricket is almost an irrelevance, I'm afraid, because if broadcast values something above something else, that can't be ignored. Instead of, a bit like I said earlier with the good or bad binary debate, instead of us thinking about that being bad and protecting all the things that we valued in history, we're better off thinking, how do we use that commercial value and broadcast value to reinforce, to resource and pay for the other things that don't earn as much? Like county championship cricket doesn't bring in much revenue. It costs more than it brings in. If we want to protect that, the money has to come from somewhere. You know, like, it's not just going to pay for itself, because it's a loss leader financially. So where does it come from? Well, probably things like the 100 and England men playing cricket. So all of these things need to coexist, and that's the complexity of it. So I think making it a this versus this debate, not suggesting you guys were, certainly, but if you're making it this debate isn't the answer.
Yeah.
We've got to think about, how do these things coexist? How do we make the most of the commercial value? How do we use that money to protect the things that we really care about, deeply about? And actually, the international game probably needs to ask itself some questions about international schedule and Test cricket in countries where it's less obviously a priority. Some nations playing 5 tests a year, often in front of empty crowds. That's the reality that we're staring into. So look, I don't know what the answers are. It's pretty complex, and I hope it's not bleak for Test cricket, because I love Test cricket above anything else. But yeah, it needs some smart people to get their heads together on some prioritization, I think.
Well, Mo, I think what we can take a lot from this interview is you're a very positive guy, but you're also quite calculated as well, and you back up your answers, which I think is the reason why, obviously, you're so well thought of amongst the ECB. I know you're quite a modest guy, and I know that from reading about you, just like to sort of crack on with a job and let a lot of your work do the talking. But as two people who are obviously far from professionals, we admire you a lot from someone that's come from a different direction in the game to where you are now. And we can only thank you for what we're seeing on our screens, and when we go to the cricket for a day out, we can enjoy. And we've got a team at the minute that we're all very proud of across all formats. And long may that continue, I guess.
Yeah, look, thanks for the kind words, and as ever, thanks for having me. It's always good to chat, and I welcome any opportunity to talk about our work and the things that we do. Just provides a bit of extra context to all of the fans out there that obviously pay and watch us, and we've got the best fans in the world. So helping them to be as informed and educated on all the things that happen off the field and behind the scenes just means that they'll understand what we're doing a little bit more, and hopefully give us a bit more time if we get things wrong.
Cheers. Well, we look forward to seeing more of your content and your work in from the coming home series and the home season. So thanks very much for your time, Mo, and thanks for coming on the 212 Men.
Yeah, pleasure, gents.